I never believed 9 seconds of shaky phone video could expose a conspiracy that reached into City Hall, destroy 3 careers, rebuild 2 lives, and force America to ask the hardest question of the digital age. When does social media justice become social media revenge? What started as Marcus Washington asking for food outside Trump Tower ended with federal investigations, corporate scandals, and the most controversial case of viral accountability in New York history. But here's what shocked everyone. The homeless veteran wasn't just asking for food. He was delivering justice 5 years in the making. The October morning hit Fifth Avenue like a cold slap across the face, steam rising from manholes, creating ghostly fingers that danced between the canyon walls of glass and steel. I was grabbing my usual coffee when I first spotted him, sitting there cross-legged against the marble steps of Trump Tower, with the kind of military precision that spoke of decades of discipline burned into muscle memory. Marcus Washington held a simple cardboard sign that read, "Veteran Hungry God Bless," in careful block letters that suggested an education interrupted by war and circumstance. His weathered hands bore the telltale scars of IED explosions, small white lines that traced stories most people would never want to hear. What struck me wasn't just his quiet dignity, it was the way he positioned himself, almost ceremonially shoulders square despite everything life had thrown at him, counting under his breath in the rhythmic cadence that veterans use to manage anxiety. 1011, 1002, 1003. The golden revolving doors of the tower spun endlessly as suited figures emerged into the morning rush, most averting their eyes with the practiced indifference of people who had trained themselves not to see suffering in expensive neighborhoods. Marcus sat there for nearly 2 hours, receiving maybe $4 in loose change and half a bagel from a tourist who looked embarrassed by her own generosity. His combat boots, I noticed, were polished to a mirror shine despite his circumstances, the kind of detail that spoke to pride that poverty couldn't break. Every few minutes a helicopter would pass overhead and his shoulders would tense almost imperceptibly. A reaction so subtle that most people wouldn't catch it, but I'd seen enough veterans to recognize the signs of battles still, being fought in peaceful moments. Then she appeared like a character stepping out of a movie about power and privilege. Sarah Chen emerged from a black Tesla Model S with the fluid confidence of someone who owned every space she entered. Her designer coat spoke of success, but the worn laptop bag slung across her shoulder suggested someone who actually worked for their money rather than inherited it. She walked past Marcus twice, each time slowing her pace slightly, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. On her third pass, she stopped completely, and I could see something shift in the air between them, a recognition that went deeper than stranger helping stranger. There was purpose in her movement's calculation, in the way she positioned herself, so that her back was to the building's security cameras. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of the accent that spoke of first-generation success stories and parents who sacrificed everything for their children's futures. "How long have you been sitting here?" Marcus looked up, his brown eyes meeting hers without the downward glance of shame that poverty usually taught people. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that seemed to bypass the usual dance of charity and need. "Since 0600, ma'am," he replied, his voice hoarse from the cold but respectful, in the way that military training never really leaves a person. Same routine for 5 days running. His internal clock, I realized, was still set to military time even years after leaving service. What happened next would later be dissected by millions of viewers, analyzed by social media experts, and studied in journalism schools as either the perfect example of investigative reporting or the most dangerous precedent in trial by internet. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill, more money than Marcus had probably seen in weeks. But it wasn't just the money that made this moment different, it was the business card she handed him alongside it. Thick paper stock that suggested importance with something written hastily on the back, in the kind of handwriting that came from expensive private schools and Ivy League educations. "There's a diner around the corner," she said, her tone shifting from casual kindness to something more businesslike, more purposeful. "Tell them Sarah sent you and order whatever you want. But first I need you to go to the Marriott Marquis Room 1247. Ask the desk clerk for the Phoenix file and tell them Sarah Chen sent you. It's time to finish what my father started." Marcus stared at the card, then at her face, and I watched as confusion flickered across his weathered features like clouds passing over the sun. "Ma'am, I can't accept this much money," he said, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "I just needed something small to get through the morning. That was when everything changed, because standing in the shadow of the tower's entrance, watching this entire exchange with growing fury that made his neck veins bulge like garden hoses, was someone who had very different ideas about how this interaction should end. Derek Castellano emerged from behind the glass doors like a storm front, breaking over the city 6 feet 2 inches of barely controlled aggression, wrapped in a security uniform that seemed 2 sizes too small for his ambitions. At 46, Derek had the kind of build that suggested either military service gone soft or prison time, translated into gym muscle, and the way his hand instinctively moved to the pepper spray on his belt told its own story about how he solved problems. "Hey, you can't panhandle here," he barked at Marcus while completely ignoring Sarah's presence, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years being the biggest fish in very small ponds. "This is private property. No soliciting, no loitering, no nothing." His radio crackled with static and voices discussing zero-tolerance policies and corporate liability concerns, the kind of background noise that revealed this wasn't Derek's first encounter with people like Marcus. The prominent no soliciting sign on the building's glass facade caught the morning sun like a warning positioned perfectly to reflect light into the eyes of anyone who might challenge the message. Marcus started to rise slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that sudden movements could be misinterpreted by men like Derek. His military training was evident in every gesture, the way he kept his hands visible, the calm alertness that suggested he was assessing threats and escape routes, even while appearing cooperative. But Sarah didn't move an inch. In fact, she stepped closer to Derek, her posture shifting from charitable passerby to something much more dangerous, something predatory. "Actually," she said, her voice taking on an edge that could cut through steel and slice through assumptions, "the sidewalk is public property, and this gentleman is exercising his First Amendment right to free speech." Derek's face flushed the deep red of someone whose authority had just been questioned by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "Lady, I don't care what amendment you think this is," he snarled, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. "I've got orders to keep the riffraff away from this building, and that's exactly what I intend to do." The word riffraff hung in the air like a slur, and I watched Marcus's hands clench slightly, the only outward sign of the storm brewing behind his controlled exterior. Sarah's expression shifted to something that reminded me of a shark that had just detected blood in the water. "Riffraff," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the word and finding it particularly revealing. "That's an interesting choice of terminology, officer." She emphasized the word officer in a way that suggested she knew something about Derek's background that he probably wished she didn't. Derek grabbed Marcus's cardboard sign and crushed it in his meaty fists, the careful block letters disappearing under the pressure of his frustration. "Their problem solved," he said, with the satisfaction of someone who thought force was always the right answer. "Now move along, both of you, before I decide to call this in as a disturbance." But as Derek turned to walk back to his position of petty authority, Sarah pulled out her phone with movements so quick and precise they seemed choreographed for maximum impact. The soft click of her camera shutter was barely audible above the street noise, but Derek spun around as if she had fired a warning shot. "Delete that," he demanded, reaching for her phone with the same casual entitlement that had probably defined most of his interactions with people he considered powerless. That was his first mistake, and possibly his last one, as a man who could operate in the shadows. Sarah stepped back with the fluid grace of someone who had been in confrontations before, keeping her device just out of reach, while maintaining eye contact that never wavered. "Delete what exactly?" she asked, with mock innocence that fooled absolutely no one. "The evidence of you destroying someone else's property, the documentation of you violating his civil rights, or perhaps the recording I've been making since you first opened your mouth and started digging your own grave." The color drained from Derek's face as the implications began to penetrate his anger, and I realized he was starting to understand that he had just stepped into quicksand while wearing concrete boots. Marcus looked between them both, clearly sensing that something much bigger than a simple confrontation was brewing around him like a storm gathering force. The business card Sarah had given him was still clutched in his weathered hand, and I found myself wondering what secrets were written on its back. What Phoenix file could possibly justify this elaborate setup? As if summoned by the tension crackling in the air like electricity before lightning, a crowd began to gather with the magnetic pull that conflict always seemed to exert on human curiosity. Office workers on coffee breaks, tourists with cameras already out, and recording street vendors craning their necks to see the drama unfolding in front of one of the most recognizable buildings in America. Someone in the crowd had their phone out too, and then another person and another, until suddenly Derek found himself surrounded by a constellation of recording devices, like a suspect in a perp walk. His authority, so absolute just moments before, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny like a sandcastle facing the incoming tide. Marcus stood up slowly, brushing imaginary dirt from his jeans with a dignity that seemed to shame everyone present. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much conflict in his lifetime. "I don't want any trouble for anyone. Maybe I should just move on to somewhere else." But Sarah shook her head with the firmness of someone who had been planning this moment for longer than anyone realized. "The only person who should be leaving," she said, her eyes never leaving Derek's increasingly panicked face, "is the one who thinks destroying property and harassing citizens is part of his job description." Her smile had taken on a quality that made my skin crawl with anticipation, the kind of expression that suggested she was enjoying Derek's discomfort in ways that probably weren't entirely healthy. That was when Sarah did something that made everyone present freeze, like actors who had forgotten their lines. She pulled out a second phone, this one clearly different from her personal device professional equipment that spoke of serious journalism rather than casual social media. "Hi," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear and record. "This is Sarah Chen from Channel 7 Investigative Unit. I'm going to need a camera crew at Trump Tower immediately, because we have a story developing that's going to change how this city thinks about power and accountability." The words hit Derek like a physical blow, and I watched his entire demeanor shift from aggressive authority to barely controlled panic. His hand froze halfway to his radio, and I realized that suddenly this wasn't just about a homeless veteran and an overzealous security guard. This was about a news reporter who had just documented everything, and in our age of social media and viral justice, that meant this story was about to explode far beyond the confines of Fifth Avenue into something none of them could control. Marcus stared at Sarah with new understanding dawning in his eyes like sunrise breaking over a battlefield. "Chen," he said, slowly recognition flooding his voice. "Sarah Chen. You're Lieutenant Chen's daughter, aren't you?" Sarah nodded, and the smile that crossed her face was equal parts sadness and satisfaction. "Afghanistan 2019, she said. "You were there when the convoy hit those IEDs, when my father tried to save his unit, even though someone had given them faulty intelligence about safe routes." Derek's radio crashed to the pavement, the plastic casing splitting like his carefully constructed world, because suddenly this wasn't about homeless policies, or building security, or even corporate liability. This was about ghosts from a war zone, half a world away, about debts that had been waiting 5 years to be collected, and about the kind of justice that doesn't come from courts or lawyers, but from the intersection of truth and technology in the hands of people who refuse to let the past stay buried. Sarah stepped closer to Derek, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout could have managed. "You have about 30 seconds to decide how you want this story to end, Derek," she said. "Do you want to be the security guard who learned about human dignity, or do you want to be the man who becomes a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons? Because what you don't know yet is that I've been planning this moment since my father's funeral, and the Phoenix file contains enough evidence to destroy more than just your career." The crowd was growing larger now, phones recording from every angle, and I could practically see Derek's mind racing as he calculated his rapidly diminishing options like a chess player realizing he was 3 moves from checkmate. Marcus remained silent, but there was something in his military bearing that suggested he was far from the helpless victim everyone had assumed him to be. The business card in his hand seemed to pulse with secrets, and Sarah's confidence suggested she held cards that would reshape this entire game. Because what nobody knew yet, what would only come to light in the hours and days that followed, was that this morning's confrontation was about to reveal connections that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The homeless veteran, the investigative reporter, the security guard with secrets, they were all pieces of a puzzle that was about to expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of city government, and the 9-second video that was about to go viral would prove that sometimes the most important revolutions start with someone simply refusing to look away when power tries to silence the powerless. Marcus entered room 1247 at the Marriott Marquis, with hands that trembled slightly as he turned the keycard. Sarah had somehow arranged for him. The luxury suite felt like stepping into a different universe, all marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city he had been sleeping rough in for months. But it wasn't the opulence that made his breath catch in his throat, it was the war room that Sarah Chen had constructed across every available surface. The Phoenix file wasn't just a folder, it was an entire investigation that had consumed years of her life, transforming grief into an instrument of surgical precision that would have impressed his old commanding officers back in Afghanistan. The diesel smell from a passing truck on the street below triggered something deep in Marcus's nervous system, sending him straight back to that checkpoint where Lieutenant Chen had died, screaming warnings about improvised explosive devices that someone had failed to detect or deliberately ignored. The sound of his own breathing became the sound of helicopter rotors. The marble floor beneath his feet transformed into Afghan sand, And suddenly he was 26 again, watching his unit leader die, because intelligence had been compromised by someone who valued money more than American lives. Focus, Washington, he whispered to himself, using the same mantra that had gotten him through 3 tours and 2 decades of survivor's guilt. Chen's daughter needs you to be present, not lost in memories of desert warfare. Sarah had been waiting for him with the patience of someone who understood trauma. 3 years of obsessive investigation spread across the hotel room like evidence from a federal task force operation. 147 photographs of Derek's misconduct lined the walls, each image tagged with dates, times, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning back to Derek's first day on the job. Financial records showed suspicious deposits into Derek's bank account, always in amounts just under the federal reporting requirements, always timed to coincide with incidents where homeless veterans had been removed from the building's vicinity with unusual force or frequency. I may have crossed some legal boundaries gathering this information, Sarah admitted, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with ethical dilemmas in the dark hours when obsession replaced sleep. I've been tracking Derek since my father's funeral, since I realized that the man who provided faulty intelligence about that convoy was living comfortably in New York while Dad was buried at Arlington. This started as grief, Marcus, but it became something larger when I realized Derek wasn't just a war criminal. He was actively harming veterans here at home, using his position to abuse the very people my father died protecting. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the scope of Sarah's surveillance, recognizing methods that belonged in federal investigations rather than private vendettas. The evidence was compelling, but it had been obtained through means that could compromise any legal proceedings, turning solid criminal behavior into inadmissible fruit from a poisoned investigative tree. Sarah, he said carefully, choosing words that wouldn't trigger her obvious emotional investment in the case, some of this evidence won't hold up in court if it was gathered without proper warrants or legal authority. We need to be strategic about how we proceed, or Derek walks away from this completely untouched by consequences. Meanwhile, across the city, Jenny Martinez was discovering that viral success came with unexpected complications that her 19-year-old understanding of social media hadn't prepared her for. Her live stream from outside Trump Tower had initially exploded to 2.3 million views, with hashtags like Justice for Marcus and Veteran Rights trending across multiple platforms simultaneously. But algorithmic changes had begun throttling her content, reducing her reach from millions to hundreds of thousands, as automated systems flagged her video for containing controversial political content that advertisers preferred to avoid. The comments section had transformed from overwhelming support into a battleground where coordinated bot accounts flooded every thread with pro-Derek narratives designed to shift public opinion. Corporate damage control was already in motion before most people had finished watching Jenny's original video. Building management released a carefully crafted statement describing Derek Castellano as an exemplary employee with a spotless record, someone who had been professionally handling a difficult situation involving an individual with a history of aggressive panhandling in the area. The narrative painted Marcus as a repeat offender, someone who targeted upscale buildings with sob stories designed to extract maximum sympathy and financial benefit from guilty wealthy pedestrians who preferred paying small amounts to avoiding confrontation entirely. Elena Rodriguez arrived at the hotel that evening with the kind of legal credentials that should have provided reassurance, but something in her demeanor set off alarm bells that Marcus's military training had taught him never to ignore. She reviewed the Phoenix file with professional efficiency, immediately identifying which evidence would be admissible in federal court and which materials would be thrown out during preliminary hearings. Half of this won't survive judicial scrutiny, she informed them, her tone suggesting she had dealt with overzealous amateur investigators before. Evidence obtained without proper warrants or legal authority becomes worthless the moment Derek's lawyers challenge its admissibility. What Marcus and Sarah didn't realize was that Elena was simultaneously having very different conversations with other parties, conversations that would fundamentally compromise everything they hoped to accomplish. Her law firm represented the insurance company that covered liability issues for the building management company, creating conflicts of interest that she had chosen not to disclose to her new clients. Keep the investigation focused strictly on Castellano's individual behavior, she had advised her real employers earlier that day. Don't let this expand into systematic institutional problems that could cost the building ownership millions in settlements and regulatory oversight. Derek somehow knew about the Phoenix file's contents before Elena had finished her initial review information that could only have come from someone with access to their private meetings and confidential materials. His confidence returned like a man who had been holding losing cards until someone slipped him an ace and his public statements shifted from defensive damage control to aggressive counterattacks that painted him as the victim of an elaborate setup orchestrated by professional activists who made careers from manufacturing outrage against hardworking security personnel. The business card Sarah had given Marcus contained more than just hotel information and meeting instructions. Written in careful handwriting on the back were the words, "Time to finish what Dad started," along with a phone number that connected to a secure line Sarah had been using to coordinate with federal investigators who had been building their own case against corruption networks operating throughout the city's most profitable commercial districts. The Phoenix file was never meant to be used in civilian court. It was designed to provide supporting evidence for a much larger federal investigation that had been quietly gathering momentum for over 18 months. Marcus realized he was holding evidence that could destroy more than just Derek's career when he found the final folder hidden behind Sarah's laptop containing financial records that implicated building management city officials and a network of security contractors who had been systematically bilking veteran services programs while simultaneously harassing the very people those programs were designed to help. But Derek's sudden knowledge of their investigation meant someone was feeding him information from inside their supposedly secure operation, and that betrayal would force them to accelerate their timeline in ways that none of them were prepared for. Marcus followed Elena Rodriguez through the shadows of Bryant Park at midnight, his military surveillance training allowing him to maintain distance, while documenting the conversation that would shatter their entire operation. Elena spoke into her phone with the casual confidence of someone who believed she controlled all the variables in a complex equation, unaware that her supposed allies were recording every word she spoke. Keep the investigation focused strictly on security guard behavior, only she instructed her real client on the other end of the secure line. Building management cannot be exposed under any circumstances regardless of what evidence these amateurs think they've collected against institutional corruption. The betrayal cut deeper than Marcus had expected, not because Elena had hidden her true loyalties, but because her duplicity meant that Sarah's 3 years of obsessive investigation were about to be neutralized by legal technicalities and conflicts of interest that would protect everyone except the veterans who deserve justice. Elena's law firm represented insurance companies that covered liability issues for half the commercial real estate in Manhattan, creating a web of financial entanglements that made genuine advocacy impossible. Her assignment had never been winning their case. It had been limiting the scope of potential damage to her firm's corporate clients, while maintaining plausible deniability about her true agenda. Sarah discovered the extent of their compromise when Channel 7's news director called her into his office with the kind of grim expression that usually preceded career-ending conversations. "Corporate advertising revenue is at risk if we continue pursuing this story," he explained, pulling out financial projections that showed exactly how much money the station stood to lose if building management and their affiliated companies pulled their substantial marketing budgets from the network. "You're being reassigned to human interest features effective immediately, and all materials related to the Castellano investigation need to be turned over to legal for review and potential disposal." The systematic dismantling of their case accelerated throughout that week as Derek's counter-narrative gained momentum through carefully orchestrated media appearances that painted him as a dedicated veteran himself, someone who understood the challenges of military service, but refused to enable destructive behaviors that harmed genuine recovery efforts. His story positioned Marcus as a professional victim who targeted upscale locations with manipulative sob stories, someone who had been coached by activist journalists to manufacture outrage for financial and political benefit. Real veterans find work instead of excuses. Derek proclaimed during his interview on a morning talk show, his security uniform replaced with business casual attire that softened his intimidating physical presence. Jenny Martinez watched her platform crumble in real time, as sophisticated bot networks flooded her content with harassment designed to discredit both her credibility and her mental stability. Her original video documenting Derek's behavior had been replaced with an edited version that removed his most egregious actions while amplifying moments that could be interpreted as Marcus acting aggressively or threateningly toward process. Building security. 100,000 followers disappeared overnight due to terms of service violations that were never clearly explained, while algorithm changes reduced her reach from millions to thousands of viewers who were increasingly skeptical about her motivations and accuracy. The psychological warfare extended beyond social media manipulation into Marcus's personal life, as his carefully maintained sobriety came under assault from stress levels that triggered post-traumatic episodes he hadn't experienced in months. The helicopter sounds from news coverage of their story became indistinguishable from the rotors that had evacuated casualties from Lieutenant Chen's convoy, while the diesel smell from city buses transformed every street corner into an Afghan checkpoint where improvised explosive devices waited beneath innocent-looking debris. Sarah found him hyperventilating in the hotel bathroom, surrounded by empty bottles that spoke to coping mechanisms he had hoped were permanently abandoned. "Maybe Derek is right about me," Marcus whispered during his breakdown, his voice carrying the hollow despair of someone whose identity had been systematically deconstructed by people who understood exactly which psychological pressure points would cause maximum damage. "Maybe I am just broken goods, looking for handouts from people who feel guilty about their privilege. Maybe veterans like me do more harm than good when we refuse to disappear quietly into whatever holes society has prepared for people it doesn't want to acknowledge or support." Derek's confidence returned with the swagger of someone who had been holding losing cards until powerful allies provided him with a winning hand that guaranteed victory regardless of his actual guilt or innocence. Building management not only refused to discipline him but publicly commended his professional handling of a difficult situation involving individuals they described as activist agitators who posed genuine security threats to tenants and visitors. His personnel file, previously containing numerous complaints about excessive force and discriminatory enforcement, had been mysteriously purged of problematic entries, while being supplemented with glowing recommendations from supervisors who praised his dedication to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. The revelation that transformed their desperate situation into something resembling hope came when Marcus finally revealed the secret he had been keeping from Sarah since their first meeting outside Trump Tower. His role as an undercover investigator for the Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General had placed him in position to document systematic fraud that went far beyond Derek's individual misconduct, encompassing a network of contractors and officials who had been stealing veteran benefits while simultaneously criminalizing the very people those programs were designed to serve. Sarah stared at the federal credentials Marcus produced from his jacket pocket credentials that meant his months of apparent homelessness had actually been an elaborate surveillance operation targeting corruption networks that stretched from street-level security guards to city hall offices, where policies were shaped by financial incentives rather than public service commitments. The Phoenix file she had compiled through obsessive grief-driven investigation suddenly became supporting evidence for a federal case that had been building methodically for over 2 years, with Marcus serving as the primary undercover asset-gathering intelligence on criminal enterprises that operated under cover of legitimate security and social service contracts. Elena Rodriguez's betrayal, while devastating to their emotional investment in obtaining justice, had inadvertently accelerated federal interest in the case by demonstrating the extent to which legal and corporate institutions were willing to compromise professional ethics to protect profitable corruption networks. Her conflicts of interest provided federal prosecutors with additional charges related to obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud government benefit programs, transforming her from a compromised attorney into a key witness whose cooperation would be obtained through plea negotiations rather than client confidentiality protections. Derek's moment of triumph was about to become the catalyst for his complete destruction because his public statements denying wrongdoing had been made while federal agents were recording his private communications with the very criminal contacts whose bribes had been funding his lifestyle for years. The building management's decision to publicly support him had created institutional liability that would eventually cost them far more than the modest settlements they had been trying to avoid, while his media appearances had provided prosecutors with evidence of consciousness of guilt that would be devastating during criminal proceedings. Marcus revealed his federal credentials to Sarah with the careful precision of someone who had been maintaining deep cover for 26 months, his apparent homelessness serving as the perfect camouflage for a Department of Veterans Affairs investigation that reached far beyond Derek's individual crimes into systematic fraud networks that stretched throughout the city's most profitable commercial districts. The worn leather wallet contained identification that transformed everything Sarah thought she knew about their relationship, revealing that his military bearing and psychological resilience hadn't been products of personal strength alone, but indicators of ongoing federal employment that required him to maintain operational security even when building trust with potential allies who shared his commitment to justice. The scope of corruption Marcus had documented through his undercover work dwarfed even Sarah's obsessive 3-year investigation encompassing security companies that received government contracts to provide services for veteran programs while simultaneously harassing and criminalizing the very populations they were supposed to be helping. Derek's building was merely one node in a network that included 6 major commercial properties, 12 security firms, and an estimated $4.7 million in diverted veteran benefits that had been stolen through fraudulent billing schemes and ghost employee arrangements that existed only on paper submitted to federal oversight agencies. Sarah's Phoenix file, compiled through grief and determination, suddenly became supporting evidence for federal prosecutors who had been methodically building cases against multiple targets while waiting for the perfect moment to simultaneously arrest dozens of co-conspirators who believed their positions of authority made them untouchable. Her emotional investment in exposing Derek's crimes had accidentally provided federal investigators with civilian witnesses and documentary evidence that would be crucial for explaining complex financial crimes to juries who needed to understand how institutional corruption directly harmed individual victims like Marcus and the hundreds of other veterans who had been systematically abused. The revelation transformed their desperate situation from amateur activism into professional law enforcement cooperation. But it also meant that Marcus had been gathering evidence on Sarah herself during their growing partnership, documenting her methods and motivations to ensure that her vigilante investigation wouldn't compromise federal prosecutions that required pristine evidence chains and unimpeachable witness testimony. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of apparent vulnerability had been simultaneously genuine emotional connection and careful intelligence gathering that balanced human empathy with professional obligations to maintain operational security at all costs. Elena Rodriguez's betrayal became significantly more dangerous when federal agents realized she had been feeding information not just to building management, but to organized crime figures who used security companies as fronts for money laundering operations that processed proceeds from drug trafficking, human smuggling, and weapons sales through legitimate contracts with city agencies. Her law firm's client list read like a directory of shell companies that existed primarily to obscure the source of criminal proceeds while providing plausible legal cover for financial transactions that would otherwise trigger federal monitoring systems designed to detect suspicious patterns. Derek's confidence in his legal immunity evaporated when federal surveillance teams presented him with recordings of conversations he had assumed were private, including detailed discussions with crime family associates who had been paying him substantial monthly retainers for information about federal investigations, witness identities, and law enforcement operational plans that he obtained through his girlfriend, who worked as a civilian contractor for the New York Police Department Intelligence Division. His role in the corruption network extended far beyond accepting bribes to ignore criminal activity, encompassing active participation in witness intimidation, evidence destruction, and conspiracy to obstruct federal investigations. Jenny Martinez discovered that her platform's systematic suppression had been orchestrated not by algorithm changes, but by coordinated attacks from private intelligence firms that specialized in reputation management and social media. Manipulation for clients who required problems to disappear without leaving traceable connections to their involvement. The bot networks flooding her content weren't random trolls, but professional operatives using techniques developed for foreign influence campaigns, psychological warfare operations, and corporate espionage activities that treated social media platforms as battlefields, where information could be weaponized against targeted individuals. The federal investigation accelerated dramatically when Derek, realizing his situation was hopeless, attempted to destroy evidence by accessing building security servers that contained financial records, communication logs, and surveillance footage that implicated everyone from building management to city council members who had received campaign contributions in exchange for favorable votes on security contract renewals. His panicked attempt to delete incriminating files triggered automated backup systems that preserved everything, while simultaneously alerting federal monitors who had been waiting for exactly this kind of consciousness of guilt behavior. Sarah's career resurrection began when federal prosecutors offered her exclusive access to document the investigation's progress in exchange for her agreement to follow strict guidelines that would ensure her reporting didn't compromise ongoing operations against targets who remained unaware of their impending arrests. Her relationship with Marcus evolved from emotional manipulation concerns into genuine partnership between a federal agent and a journalist whose shared commitment to exposing institutional corruption outweighed personal feelings that had developed during months of collaboration under extraordinary circumstances. Marcus's psychological struggles intensified as the investigation reached critical phases that required him to maintain his cover while federal agents prepared simultaneous raids against multiple locations, knowing that any premature exposure would allow co-conspirators to destroy evidence and flee prosecution. The post-traumatic stress episodes triggered by helicopter sounds and diesel smells were compounded by operational stress that came from living double lives, where every interaction carried potential consequences for investigations that had consumed years of work by dozens of federal agents and prosecutors. The transformation of their amateur investigation into federal law enforcement cooperation meant that Derek's destruction would be complete and systematic, encompassing criminal charges, civil liability asset forfeiture, and permanent disbarment from security industry employment, while building management faced institutional consequences that would cost millions in fines, settlements, and regulatory oversight that would fundamentally restructure how commercial real estate companies approached veteran services and public safety responsibilities throughout the city. Derek's desperation manifested in a calculated gambit that revealed the depths of his psychological manipulation skills, orchestrating an elaborate setup using Tommy Nguyen, a genuinely homeless veteran whose medical needs and financial desperation made him vulnerable to exploitation by someone who understood exactly which psychological pressure points would override moral reservations about participating in witness tampering. Derek offered Tommy $500 and promises of ongoing support in exchange for claiming that Marcus had threatened him over territorial disputes related to profitable panhandling locations, creating a narrative that would transform Marcus from sympathetic victim into aggressive predator who used military training to intimidate other veterans. The staged confrontation unfolded with theatrical precision as Derek positioned surveillance equipment to capture Marcus, responding to what appeared to be a medical emergency, knowing that Marcus's military training and personal code of ethics would compel him to provide assistance regardless of potential personal consequences. Tommy's performance was painfully convincing as he writhed on the sidewalk, clutching his chest, gasping for breath, while tourists and office workers gathered around the apparent heart attack victim, creating exactly the kind of crowd that would provide witness testimony supporting whatever narrative Derek chose to construct from selectively edited footage. Marcus approached the scene with the measured caution of someone whose undercover work had taught him to assess situations for multiple layers of deception, but his training as a combat medic overrode operational security concerns when he saw another veteran in apparent medical distress. His years of emergency response experience kicked in automatically as he knelt beside Tommy, checking pulse and breathing, while coordinating with bystanders to call emergency services, completely focused on potentially life-saving medical intervention, rather than considering how his actions might be recorded and manipulated by hostile observers. The trap's psychological cruelty became apparent when Tommy, following Derek's script, suddenly recovered enough to claim that Marcus had been demanding payment for allowing him to remain in the area, threatening violence if Tommy didn't comply with territorial arrangements that Marcus supposedly enforced on behalf of organized panhandling operations. The accusation hit Marcus like physical assault, not because it threatened his legal standing, but because it perverted his genuine desire to help fellow veterans into evidence of the predatory behavior he had dedicated his life to combating through federal law enforcement work. Jenny Martinez's Citizen Journalism Network had anticipated Derek's desperation move through social media intelligence gathering that revealed his pattern of using vulnerable individuals as weapons against targets he couldn't attack directly. Her volunteers had positioned themselves strategically around the building with multiple camera angles that captured Derek's coaching session with Tommy, recording the entire setup from initial payment through rehearsal of false accusations, creating incontrovertible evidence of witness tampering and conspiracy to file false police reports that would destroy Derek's remaining credibility with law enforcement agencies. The livestream explosion that followed Tommy's coached accusations created a real-time documentation of Derek's manipulation that reached 2.7 million viewers before building management could implement their established social media suppression protocols. Jenny's commentary provided context that helped viewers understand the sophisticated nature of Derek's psychological warfare, while her network of veteran advocates shared personal stories that illustrated how frequently homeless veterans were exploited by people in positions of authority who understood their vulnerabilities and legal disadvantages. Sarah's federal cooperation allowed her to provide viewers with background information about witness tampering investigations, while carefully avoiding details that might compromise ongoing operations against Derek's conspirators who remained unaware of their impending arrests. Her reporting transformed the staged confrontation from simple he said, dispute into a clear example of how institutional corruption created environments where vulnerable populations could be weaponized against each other, while the real perpetrators of systemic abuse escaped accountability through misdirection and victim-blaming strategies. Derek's psychological breakdown began when he realized that his manipulation had been recorded from angles he hadn't anticipated, that his careful psychological profiling of both Marcus and Tommy had been countered by federal agents who understood his methods better than he understood theirs. The livestream comments section filled with veterans sharing similar experiences of being approached by security personnel, law enforcement officials, and social service workers who had attempted to recruit them as informants or false witnesses against other veterans who were pursuing legal remedies for institutional abuse. Federal agents allowed Derek's breakdown to continue publicly because his increasingly desperate statements provided additional evidence of consciousness of guilt, while simultaneously demonstrating the extent to which corruption networks relied on psychological manipulation and victim exploitation to maintain their operations. His rant about system-wide corruption that rewarded criminal behavior inadvertently confirmed details of federal investigations that had been built through months of careful surveillance and financial analysis, essentially providing prosecutors with confession evidence that would be admissible in court. Marcus's federal handler authorized him to break cover partially in order to protect Tommy from further exploitation, while ensuring that Derek's witness tampering would be prosecuted as aggressively as his other federal crimes. The decision to reveal Marcus's law enforcement status transformed public perception of the entire confrontation, while providing Tommy with federal protection that would allow him to testify truthfully about Derek's coaching and payment without fear of retaliation from criminal organizations that use similar intimidation tactics against potential witnesses. The viral documentation of Derek's manipulation attempt created a template that federal prosecutors would use to explain similar cases throughout their broader investigation, showing juries exactly how institutional corruption operated at street level, while demonstrating the human cost of allowing criminal networks to operate under color of legitimate authority. Derek's desperation had become the key that unlocked public understanding of systematic abuse that might otherwise have remained invisible to people whose lives hadn't been directly impacted by these predatory relationships. Federal agents descended on Trump Tower like a precisely orchestrated military operation surrounding the building with unmarked vehicles. While specialized financial crimes investigators executed simultaneous search warrants at Derek's apartment building management offices and the law firm where Elena Rodriguez had been feeding information to criminal networks for over 18 months. The coordinated raids represented the culmination of a 2-year investigation that had expanded from simple veteran benefit fraud into a comprehensive examination of municipal corruption that reached into city council chambers, police, department administration, offices, and construction contract approval processes that controlled billions in public spending. Building management's executives found themselves in federal custody before their morning coffee had finished brewing their corporate lawyers, powerless to prevent asset seizure orders that froze bank accounts, real estate holdings, and offshore financial instruments that had been used to launder proceeds from criminal enterprises operating under the cover of legitimate security services. The financial records Derek had tried desperately to destroy became the foundation for racketeering charges that would dismantle the entire network of shell companies, ghost employees, and fraudulent billing schemes that had been systematically stealing veteran benefits while criminalizing the very populations those programs were designed to serve. Derek's final desperate telephone call to the people who had been protecting him revealed the expendable nature of his position within criminal organizations that treated street-level operatives as disposable assets rather than valued partners in long-term enterprises. The crime family associates who had been paying him monthly retainers for information about federal investigations and witness identities refused to accept his calls, their attorneys having advised complete separation from anyone whose arrest might compromise higher-level operations that generated far more revenue than Derek's relatively minor contributions to their overall organizational structure. Marcus experienced the psychological relief of finally abandoning his undercover persona after 26 months of maintaining false identity, while documenting systematic abuse that had required him to witness veteran suffering without being able to provide immediate assistance that might compromise federal investigations. The moment when he could reveal his law enforcement credentials to Derek represented not just professional vindication but personal healing from the guilt he had carried since Lieutenant Chen's death. transforming survivors' remorse into purposeful action that honored his fallen commander's memory through concrete achievements rather than endless self-recrimination. Sarah's embedded access to federal operations allowed her to document the intersection of institutional corruption and individual trauma in ways that traditional journalism rarely achieved, showing viewers exactly how abstract policy failures translated into street-level violence against vulnerable populations. Her reporting revealed the human faces behind financial crimes that might otherwise have been dismissed as victimless paperwork violations, demonstrating how stolen veteran benefits directly contributed to homelessness, suicide, and the kind of desperation that made people like Tommy susceptible to exploitation by predators who understood their psychological vulnerabilities. The federal interrogation room became the setting for Derek's complete psychological collapse as prosecutors presented him with evidence that made denial impossible, while offering cooperation agreements that would require him to testify against former associates who had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice him for their own protection. His federal handler explained that witness protection programs existed for people whose testimony against organized crime required permanent relocation and identity changes, but cooperation agreements came with strict requirements for complete honesty about criminal activities spanning multiple years of systematic fraud. Elena Rodriguez's law firm faced immediate dissolution as federal investigators revealed the extent to which legitimate legal practice had been perverted into criminal enterprise that used attorney-client privilege as a shield for money laundering operations, witness intimidation, and obstruction of federal investigations. Her personal cooperation with prosecutors became essential for understanding how organized crime had infiltrated professional legal services while maintaining plausible deniability about the criminal nature of their most profitable client, relationships, and financial arrangements. Jenny Martinez's platform evolution accelerated as her documentation of Derek's manipulation attempt became a case study in digital activism that balanced immediate viral impact with long-term educational value about the sophisticated nature of institutional corruption. Her audience grew beyond entertainment, seeking social media consumers to include policymakers, law enforcement professionals, and academic researchers who recognized the importance of citizen journalism in exposing systematic abuse that traditional media organizations might avoid due to corporate advertising pressures and legal liability concerns. Tommy Nguyen's federal protection allowed him to testify truthfully about Derek's coaching and payment while receiving medical treatment and housing assistance that demonstrated how veteran services could function when properly administered rather than criminally exploited. His transformation from manipulated pawn to protected witness illustrated the broader investigation's commitment to treating victims as human beings deserving dignity rather than disposable sources of evidence for prosecuting higher-level targets. The viral live stream of Derek's breakdown reached 47 million viewers across multiple platforms as social media algorithms amplified content that generated massive engagement through emotional responses ranging from satisfaction at seeing institutional corruption exposed to horror at realizing the systematic nature of veteran exploitation. The public documentation of federal law enforcement operations created unprecedented transparency in criminal justice proceedings, while demonstrating how citizen activism could complement professional investigations when properly coordinated, rather than interfering with complex operations that required careful timing and evidence preservation. Derek's complete confession to federal agents provided prosecutors with detailed information about criminal networks that extended far beyond veteran benefit fraud into areas of municipal corruption that would require additional investigations lasting several more years. His cooperation revealed the interconnected nature of seemingly separate criminal enterprises that used legitimate government contracts as vehicles for systematic theft of public resources, while creating environments where vulnerable populations could be exploited without fear of accountability from corrupted oversight systems. 6 months after the federal raids concluded, Marcus Washington found himself standing in the same spot where Derek had once destroyed his cardboard sign, but now wearing the credentials of a permanent federal employee whose work with the Department of Veterans Affairs had expanded into a national program designed to identify and prosecute systematic fraud against veteran populations. The transformation from undercover operative to public advocate represented personal healing that went far beyond professional advancement, allowing him to channel decades of survivor guilt into concrete achievements that honored Lieutenant Chen's memory through service rather than suffering that served no constructive purpose for anyone. Derek Castellano received a federal sentence of 32 months in minimum security prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation with restitution requirements, totaling $87,000 and permanent disbarment from security industry employment throughout the United States. His incarceration included mandatory participation in veteran therapy programs, where he worked with counselors who specialized in treating moral injury among former service members whose criminal behavior had violated the ethical foundations of military training they had once embraced before corruption transformed them into predators who exploited the very communities they should have been protecting. The building management executives faced significantly harsher consequences, as federal prosecutors obtained convictions on racketeering charges that resulted in asset forfeiture, totaling $12.4 million with the seized funds directed toward establishing veteran service centers in commercial districts throughout New York City, where similar exploitation had been documented through Marcus's expanded investigation. The corporate settlement included requirements for independent oversight of all security contracts, mandatory bias training for personnel who interacted with homeless populations, and quarterly reporting to federal agencies responsible for monitoring compliance with civil rights protections. Sarah Chen's embedded journalism during the federal investigation earned recognition that extended far beyond traditional media awards, positioning her as a leading expert on the intersection of institutional corruption and digital activism, whose work demonstrated how independent reporting could complement law enforcement operations without compromising prosecutorial effectiveness. Her partnership with federal agencies created new models for transparent government that allowed public access to information about corruption investigations, while maintaining operational security for ongoing cases against criminal networks that remained under surveillance. Jenny Martinez's platform matured into an educational resource that taught social media users how to document institutional abuse responsibly while avoiding the kind of viral vigilantism that could compromise legal proceedings or harm innocent people who became caught in the crossfire of poorly planned digital activism. Her audience of 3.2 million followers across multiple platforms included policymakers, law enforcement professionals, and community organizers who used her content as training material for citizen journalism projects that balanced immediate impact with long-term accountability for systematic change rather than temporary entertainment value. Elena Rodriguez's cooperation with federal prosecutors resulted in a suspended sentence and community service requirements that included providing pro bono legal services to veteran populations for 5 years, while her former law, two firms' dissolution created opportunities for ethical attorneys who specialized in civil rights advocacy to establish practices that prioritized client welfare over corporate profit margins. Her testimony against organized crime figures who had corrupted legal services resulted in additional prosecutions that dismantled money laundering operations spanning multiple states and involving hundreds of millions in criminal proceeds. Tommy Wynn's transformation from exploitation victim to federal witness illustrated the investigation's commitment to treating vulnerable populations as human beings, deserving dignity rather than disposable sources of evidence. For prosecuting higher-level targets, his recovery included stable housing, medical treatment for conditions that had been exacerbated by homelessness, and vocational training that prepared him for employment with veteran service organizations, where his personal experience with systematic abuse provided valuable insights for helping other people navigate bureaucratic systems that could be weaponized against the very populations they were designed to serve. The federal investigation's expansion revealed corruption networks in 47 additional cities, where similar fraud schemes had been operating under cover of legitimate security and social service contracts, leading to congressional hearings that resulted in comprehensive reform of veteran benefit administration and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future exploitation. The systematic nature of the abuse documented through Marcus's undercover work demonstrated how institutional corruption created environments where vulnerable populations could be criminalized while their government benefits were stolen by the same people responsible for their protection. 3 years after Derek's arrest, the bronze plaque installed at the Trump Tower entrance commemorated not just Lieutenant James Chen's sacrifice, but the broader principle that institutional corruption thrives in darkness, while transparency and accountability create environments where justice becomes possible through sustained effort rather than momentary viral satisfaction. Marcus's continuing work with federal agencies had prevented an estimated $4.7 million in veteran benefit fraud, while helping 238 homeless veterans access housing, medical care, employment services that had been systematically denied through criminal manipulation of bureaucratic systems. The lasting impact of their confrontation extended beyond individual justice to systematic policy changes that protected veteran rights throughout commercial districts where similar exploitation had been normalized through decades of institutional indifference to homeless populations. Sarah's documentary series about the investigation continued generating discussion about the balance between social media activism and professional law enforcement, while Jenny's educational content helped thousands of digital activists understand how to document abuse responsibly, without compromising their own safety or legal proceedings that required careful evidence preservation for successful prosecutions. Derek's letters from prison revealed ongoing struggles with moral injury that made genuine rehabilitation uncertain, demonstrating that justice required acknowledgement of harm caused, rather than simple punishment that failed to address the psychological factors that had transformed military service into criminal behavior. His participation in veteran therapy programs provided insights into how institutional corruption recruits participants, while highlighting the importance of early intervention for preventing similar cases among veterans whose traumatic experiences create vulnerability to exploitation by criminal organizations seeking insider access to government programs and oversight systems. Have you ever felt powerless watching injustice happen right in front of you, wondering if one person can really make a difference against corrupt systems that seem untouchable? Marcus, Sarah, and Jenny proved that ordinary people with cameras, courage, and community can expose institutional corruption and create lasting change for vulnerable populations who deserve dignity and protection. Their story shows that social media activism, when combined with responsible journalism and federal law enforcement, can transform individual trauma into systematic reform that helps thousands of veterans nationwide. Your voice matters in these fights for accountability. If you believe in using technology to expose injustice while supporting professional investigations that create real policy changes, please like this video and subscribe to Homeless Stories for more investigations that reveal how communities can work together to protect our most vulnerable citizens from institutional abuse.